So this morning we pick up the story in 2 Samuel chapter 7. Our group of chapters this morning takes us to chapter 12, although in reality we're going to focus on chapters 7 and 11 primarily, just filling in the gaps very briefly. So if you want to get the full sense of the story and the bigger picture, then it'd be really good to fill in those gaps in chapters 8, 9, 10 and 12 in your own time this week, so that when Peter picks up the story next Sunday at chapter 13, we're all up to speed. Chapter 7, we are in the middle of a real season of success and blessing for David and the people of Israel. David has become king, and they've enjoyed much success in battle. David has united the tribes under his kingship and expanded Israel's territory. Jerusalem is the political capital of Israel, and David has a vision of making it the religious capital of Israel too. So he moves the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem and shares his latest great idea with God through the prophet Nathan. He says to Nathan, now that Israel has a permanent home, I want to make the Lord a permanent home too. Nathan listens to him and seems supportive of the idea. He says in verse 3 of chapter 7, whatever you have in mind, go ahead, do it, for the Lord is with you. I find that interesting for reasons that I'll mention in a moment, I think. God had made sure that he raised up a prophet during the reign of each of the kings of Israel. The prophet's main task is to point people's attention and focus to God and to communicate God's laws and plans and messages to the king, so the king can then pass them down to the people of Israel. For the most part, the kings ignored God's prophets, but God had sent them anyway. God had given each of the kings an opportunity to hear his voice and to obey. God speaks to Nathan the same night, the same day that he told David to go for it. The Lord is with you. Whatever you've on your mind, just do it. You clearly got the favour of the Lord upon you. Go for it. But God shares his plan with Nathan, who, as the good prophets would, shared that message with the king, in this case David, and David has an opportunity to respond in obedience or in rebellion. God says to Nathan to pass on to David something of my paraphrase, I think, when I read this. Do I want you to build me a house to live in? God says, I haven't had a house since I brought Israel out of Egypt. I've been moving from place to place with you in a tent, and I quite like camping. Have I ever complained and asked one of the shepherds of my people to build me a house? Sounds like God's not as keen on the idea of having a permanent home as David is. David, he says, I took you from shepherding sheep to shepherding my people. I have been with you all the time and have blessed you with victory over your enemies. You will be a great man, one of the greatest. I am going to give my people a home. I, the Lord, will establish a house for you. And when you're dead, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, your own child. I will establish his kingdom. Your child will build a house for me. Your throne and your kingdom will last forever. Wow, what a message to get from God. This news from God leads David into prayer. Just read chapter 7, verses 18 to 29. And that prayer of humility. Remember, God honours humility and opposes pride, whether it's in his people or in others in the world. This prayer of humility before God, and this prayer of trust that what God has said will come to pass. Much of the prayer is almost a reiteration of the promise from God that Nathan has just shared with him, just emphasizing David's trust in what God has said will come to pass. This prayer from David emphasizes the glory going to God and a pure humility and trust in God and before God. Why didn't God want David to build him a house? We've mentioned this once or twice so far in conversation through our series. God had told David that his job was to unite and lead Israel and to destroy its enemies. This was not only a huge task, but it also required a huge amount of bloodshed. We know from 1 Chronicles 28:3 that God had said that he did not want a warrior to be the one to build his temple. David made the plans and collected the materials ready for his son Solomon to start building when he became king. 1 Kings 5-7. There's a lesson for us here, I think. David accepted his part in God's plan and didn't try to go beyond it. I wonder if from your experiences, if God has ever said no to your plans, I wonder how you responded. I wonder if you sulked or just went ahead with it anyway. Or if you looked for more opportunities, different opportunities that God might be giving you. There may have been very good plans, but they might not have been God's will. How did you respond? God may well have something even better than your great idea for you to be involved in, just like he did for David, actually. God's plans for David, rather, were so much greater than the prestige of building a temple. The Messiah was to come through David's line. Wow. God opposes pride and honours humility. Even when we can't see it and even when we can't feel it, God is working. And God will raise up his Messiah. Those three key themes that we've been looking at throughout this series in Samuel. And here we come to the part in the narrative where this pointing towards the coming King of Kings, the Messiah, it really begins to build and take momentum. The Messiah was to come through David's line. David's house would last forever. Jesus himself, a direct descendant of David, was to be the fulfillment of God's promise to David. And remember, all the way back to Abraham too, where you will be a blessing to all nations. Your family will be a blessing to all nations. Just read Acts chapter 2, verses 22-36. Amazing. Have you prayed with good intentions only to have God say no? This may be God's way of directing you to something even greater. Accepting God's no may require as much faith as carrying out God's yes. Accepting God's no to your great vision and great plan maybe involves even greater faith from you than having the faith to carry out God's plan for you. God doesn't always, of course, say no to our good plans and vision. Sometimes our good plans and vision connect with God's good plan and vision for us. What's important is that we're listening for God's voice. Like Nathan and like David heard and was obedient. Rather than many other examples of the kings who heard God's voice and were rebellious to that voice, just went on with their own ideas and plans and agendas. So Keep having good ideas. What I'm saying is don't be discouraged and don't have a good idea just in case it's not God's good idea for you. Keep having those good ideas, keep coming, but keep listening to God. Is this God's good idea or just my good idea? And that involves real wisdom and real discernment. I'm sure that lots of great projects have started, but not come to fruition, not grown, not blossomed, not borne fruit, because they just weren't God's plan, weren't God's good idea. Whether that might be a timing issue or a place issue or a people issue, it just wasn't God's plan. Keep having those good ideas, or keep listening to God every step of the way. And listen to the prophetic voice, listen to God's people who He's put in leadership around you as well. Chapter 8 we read that David is granted favour and conquers the surrounding nations. Verse 15, David reigns over all Israel, doing what was just and right for all his people. And in chapter 9, we see David showing kindness to Mephibosheth, who was Jonathan's son, his great, great dear friend Jonathan's son. And David restores to Mephibosheth the land that belonged to Saul, his enemy. And he extends hospitality to Mephibosheth. He says to him, there'll always be a place for you at my table. Again, showing great humility and hospitality and kindness to someone from his enemy Saul's family, who of course was also the son of his great friend Jonathan. But most kings would have been quite hostile to the families of their enemies. In fact, most kings would have destroyed the family of their enemies to remove any opportunity or any chance of their enemies' descendants starting a war and a battle against them again. So it's really striking, it's really important, it's really significant that David not only doesn't seek revenge and seek the life of Mephibosheth, but he also shows extreme kindness and humility and hospitality to him. I suspect because he was Jonathan's son. One of my regrets is I don't think we didn't go deep enough into the relationship between David and Jonathan in this series. Maybe we'll pick up that friendship another time. God lifts up humility and opposes pride. God is at work even when we can't see it. God is paving the way for the Messiah who will come. In chapter 10, we see David enjoying another victory over the Ammonites. And then we come to chapter 11. After uniting the nation and restoring peace, after attaining great military power, we see David's personal life becoming entangled in sin. We know this from the life of David, from what we already know of the life of David. People have commented in our conversations about our sermons throughout this series. And it's a temptation to, for example, to compare almost a polar opposite. David, man after God's heart. Saul, man who became bitter and self-seeking and not after God's heart. But we know that there was good attributes to Saul and bad attributes in David's life too. So it's complicated. It's messier than often we like to imagine. We like to make it clean and simple. David in the good box, Saul in the bad box. But, people are complicated. Life is complicated. And the truth is, even with all the favour of God that was on David's life, and his knowledge and experience and trust and humility, David messed up. We know David messed up in a big way. He just became entangled. This slippery slope of sin. I remember using that idea of a slippery slope. I'm talking about Saul a couple of weeks ago, and now I'm using it talking about David. Chapter 11, verse 1. It's significant when David sent Joab out with his men and the whole army to destroy the Ammonites and besiege Rabbah. It's significant that David remained in Jerusalem. David really ought to have gone with his men in battle. The first mistake from David's point of view was to abandon his purpose by staying at home from war. His second step on that slippery slope was to focus on his own desires instead of God's desires. Verse 2. One evening David got up from his bed, walked around the roof of the palace. From the roof he saw a woman washing. The woman was very beautiful, and David sent someone to find out about her. The man said, "She is Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite." David saw a beautiful woman, was overcome with desire for her. Not necessarily sinful in itself if we respond to that in the right way, but what was David's response? David's response was to pursue, to look into, to delve into the temptation instead of turning away from it. Verse 3, when he sent someone to inquire of her and to seek to find a way. David deliberately sinned. He sent messengers to get her after inquiring about her. See how it's getting deeper and deeper. She came to him. He slept with her. He deliberately sinned. Not only did he deliberately sin, but Bathsheba became pregnant to David. And we know it was to David because of that little line, which I found quite curious initially, where it talks about Bathsheba. She just finished purifying herself from her monthly uncleanliness. She was going through the ritual purification required after the menstrual cycle had finished. So and that little parenthesis is put in there to show that she wasn't already pregnant to her husband Uriah the Hittite, to emphasize it was David's child. David starts a process of trying to cover up his sin by deceiving other people in his sphere of awareness and in friendship and influence. Verse 6 to 15. He sets out a plan to have Uriah killed. He commits murder to continue the cover-up, verses 5, 15 and 17 of chapter 11. And we see through chapter 11, chapter 12, chapters 14, chapters 11 and 12, we see the consequences of David's sin were far-reaching and affected many. David could have chosen to stop and turn away from his sin at any point. But once we start on the road of sin, it's difficult to stop. James chapter 1, verses 14 and 15. The deeper the mess, the less we want to admit that we had a part to play on it or even instigated it. So we hide, and it grows. It's much easier to stop sliding down a hill when you're at the top rather than when you're halfway down. We can't focus on this passage without really having a bit more focus on this temptation thing. It's such an issue of discipleship in many people's life, whatever the temptation might be, not always sexual. David looked from the roof of the palace. He saw Bathsheba. He lusted after her. Rather than leaving the roof and going back inside, he entertained the temptation. He allowed it to take root. He found out who she was. He sent for her. He slept with her. The results were devastating. I want to encourage us, each and every one of us, to know our weaknesses. Like we mentioned a couple of weeks ago again with the life of Saul. To be self-aware. To be emotionally intelligent. That might require work, that might require some mentoring and discipleship and companionship along the way. Guard against your weaknesses, guard against the things that easily tempt you. Be prayerful. Seek God's help in that as well as the help of others. But give your prayers legs by doing things to help yourself, like seeking the help of others, like moving away from situations and doing what you can to avoid opportunities to be tempted and to succumb to that temptation, rather than consciously engaging in the destructive behaviour. Know the scriptures, friends, and speak them over yourself. The scriptures that are pertinent to your particular struggle. Write them down and place them around your house. But most importantly, memorize them and place them in your heart to help yourself to stay clear and free from the temptation and the destruction that can come with succumbing to that temptation. Strikes me that Bathsheba and Joab in this story were both put into difficult situations. Bathsheba had a choice, I guess. She knew it was wrong to commit adultery, so she didn't have to go to David. But then she risked being put to death if she refused an order from the king. What would you do? Joab was given a choice, I guess. He didn't know why Uriah the Hittite had to die. Didn't make sense to him, but he knew that the king wanted Uriah dead. And again, he would have been aware of the king's power over him should he fail to have carried out the king's wishes. Do you know what it is to be in a situation where there only appears to be two choices and both seem wrong? Don't lose sight of what God wants in your life and for you and through your life. If you're in a situation where there seems to be two choices, and I say the lesser of two evils, that neither choice seems to be right, wait for God to show you the right way, his way for you. Chapter 12, we see Nathan rebuking David, and we see some of the consequences springing from David's actions. David does repent. Chapter 12, verse 13. He is forgiven, but the consequences remain from his actions in his life and in the lives of others. David and Bathsheba are reunited and have another son, who they name Solomon. We'll pick that story on in the chapters ahead. But let us commit to being people marked by our humility. Let us believe that God is at work, even when we don't see it, even when we can't feel it. Let us celebrate the Messiah, Jesus, who came from this messy line. He dwelt in our messy world. He redeemed this messy life in his plan and purpose and for his glory. Amen.